Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, based on your geographic location this morning or at this time. My name is Khalil Jahshan, and I would like to welcome you to Arab Center, Washington, for this special webinar today, focusing on a topic that is dear to us at the center, the situation in Yemen. The exact title of the event today is Yemen Policy under Biden, Opportunities and Challenges. As you all know, the multi-sided war in Yemen that began in mid-September 2014 has resulted in the world's largest and worst humanitarian crisis, with over 130,000 people killed, an estimated 85 to 100,000 due to famine, 4 million displaced, and 24 million out of a total population of about 30 million are in need of humanitarian assistance and face acute food security. The UN Humanitarian Office, OCHA, estimates the combined number of war dead from direct and indirect causes at about 235,000. It's been a real serious humanitarian emergency. What started as a limited civil war with a tribal dimension quickly emerged into a regional war, with a growing number of international participants coming to the rescue of their respective allies. The US has been an active party in this conflict since its very inception, through its military support to its allies, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with regards to sharing logistics, training, and arms sales. When President Biden took over or took office on January 20th, he quite quickly declared that the Saudi-led war in Yemen has to end, quote, end of quote. Now, the administration suspended since then the terrorism sanctions that former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo imposed on Yemen's Houthi rebels, and temporarily halted arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, subject to routine reassessment that new administrations tend to do. Subsequent to that, the administration announced that the US will no longer support offensive military operations in Yemen, opting instead to actively support the UN's initiative to impose ceasefire, open humanitarian channels, and restore peace talks. Deputy Secretary of State Tim Lenderking was appointed as U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen and was promptly dispatched to the region for meetings with the relevant parties. Meanwhile, intermittent talks, ceasefires, prisoner exchange agreements between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthi group have not really led to significant progress in terms of resolving Yemen's war. We have been somehow excited to see these wave after wave of attempts at negotiating come and go without, unfortunately, reducing the pace of the ongoing fighting. To help us make sense of all these developments, we have convened today a list of distinguished activists, scholars, and practitioners to provide you with an update on the complex situation in the country of Yemen and its humanitarian conditions, help us analyze the framework and the outlook for the ongoing peace talks and UN initiatives. Also, we would like to examine the impact and implications, as the title implied, of US policy shift under President Biden, even though it's only a few weeks old, and try to assess the prospects for ending the war in Yemen. We're very grateful for our guests for their willingness to join us and help us better understand this complex conflict. We look forward to a productive exchange with them in this webinar. Again, a warm welcome to all of you. Actually, we have a very impressive audience today. Several hundred people have registered for that, and they seem to be joining us gradually. And We particularly welcome members, I see names, the members of the diplomatic community, some staffers from Congress, definitely a lot of our colleagues from research centers, think tanks, human rights organizations, and an audience almost half, I would say, US based, and the rest is international. So we're very delighted to have you today, and I'm sure you will be enjoying the exchange with our guest speakers. The way we will proceed is I will just introduce by name. There is no need to go through lengthy introductions. The introductions are available on the website of the center. I will just introduce our speakers in the order in which they will speak. And then we will go ahead and proceed by giving each one of the speaker 10 to 12 minutes max to be able to share the time. Just in summary, some of the key points based on their own specialization and kind of angle that they're looking at the conflict with which they're looking at the conflict today. And then we'll open up the floor by using the balance of our time, about 30 minutes or so at the end for Q&A to give you, our audience, a chance to interact with our guests. We will be beginning with Abdulwahab Alkebsi, who is Managing Director for Programs at the Center for International Private Enterprise. He will be followed by Samar Nasser, the Chief Executive Officer of Yemen Aid. Then Sama Al-Hamdani, who's a known Yemeni analyst and media commentator, founder and executive director of the Yemen Cultural Institute, and Nadwa Al-Dawsari, a non-resident scholar at Middle East Institute, and last but not least, our good friend Nabeel Khoury, the senior non-resident fellow at Atlantic Council and former DCM at the US Embassy in Sana'a between 2004 and 2007. So let me begin again, just to remind you that if you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A section in the page or email the website at Arab Center with your question, and I will be more than delighted during the Q&A to pass your questions on to our speakers. So without further delay, let's go ahead and proceed. Abdulwahab, give us your overview of what I refer to as this complex conflict in Yemen in terms of understanding its challenges and prospects. Abdulwahab.
Thank you very much, Khalil. And complex is the word to use today, the operative word of what you said. Thank you for the overall picture. I want to thank you, Khalil, and the Arab Center for discussing this very important issue, but also for me personally to get me together with a bunch of my friends that I've missed for a long time. So thank you very much for that, Khalil. And let me start with the good news. There's definite momentum towards peace in Yemen that we haven't seen in a long time. Definite momentum. It's palpable momentum that at least me personally haven't seen in a long time. And there are many reasons for it. Some of them you've alluded to. And whether you like it or not, the issues I'm going to highlight really created this momentum, and now the momentum continues. And the first one is probably the revocation of the designation of the foreign terrorist organization of the Houthis. Now, ironically, I think the actual designation itself is what created the momentum. So as soon as the Houthis were designated, you felt a swell of organizations, UN, others complaining about it, which elevated Yemen into a higher position in Yemen foreign policy. So when the new administration came in, there was pressure, there was movement towards doing something about Yemen. So Yemen right now, and State Department has declared it as a top priority for foreign policy of the United States. That is momentum. That is really good momentum. Again, whether you like it or not, whether you like the revocation or the designation is a subject matter. And also the freeze of the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. But more than that, tying it to offensive, and you need to understand the words that were used when that was announced, tied to offensive operations in Yemen. So it's not just the weapons, any weapons that can be used in offensive operations, whether the weapons themselves are defensive or offensive. If they're used for offensive operations in Yemen, that was frozen. That also created momentum, whether you like the freezing or not, it created momentum and people were listening. The appointment of a special envoy Lender King's appointments is also very important. The statements he has made since. On Tuesday, he said there were back channel talks with the Houthis. They're trying to re-engage Saudi Houthi talks. Again, whether you agree with it or not is not the important thing. It's also creating momentum. And finally, I've been hearing, I'm sure you've been hearing, the United States finally is looking at Yemen, not from a Saudi prism, but looking at Yemen from a US foreign policy objectives and priorities prism, which is also important, which creates tremendous momentum. So lots of momentum, lots of good news. However, as you said, Khalil, and the operative word here is the complexity. It is a very complex issue. So just getting people in Geneva around the table, and I'm gonna hurt a lot of people by saying this, a lot of them don't want the war to end. These are the ones who benefit from the war. Let's just state it openly. So the people that get around the table, that's not enough for them to shake hands and sign a piece of paper. That's no longer enough. This is a very complex issues at the international and global, at the regional, at the national, at the subnational level. This is a very complex issues, and like all complex issues, it needs a complex approach. All these issues need to be addressed. So from the international and global level, you know, the global powers competition, China's Belt and Road, what the Chinese want, what the Americans want, what the British want, all of that is important. But Yemen is an epicenter of the war on terror. Global terrorism has an epicenter in Yemen, and that has to be addressed. It's important. You cannot take that aside. So from a global perspective, terrorism is important to address, and it needs to be part of any solution moving forward. That issue needs to be addressed. From a regional perspective, and I'm trying to go very fast because each one of these issues has history and dynamics and complexities. Saudi Arabia as a regional power has dominated Yemen since the 1960s, really dominated. And I'm underlining the word, I'm not being shy. Has dominated politics, economy, foreign policy of Yemen since the 1960s until the Arab Spring of 2011 and felt a threat from there. It's his backyard. And if you tie that with Iran, a newcomer into Yemen, an ascended power in Yemen, and the competition between the two right now is affecting Yemen. Add to that, the UAE, some people see it as coinciding with the objectives of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. I don't see them that way. They have divergent at times, sometimes convergent objectives in Yemen. UAE has ambitions that are regional and global, with maritime footprints that it needs in Djibouti, in Somalia, in Eritrea. Yemen is the crown jewel of all of that. So Qatar, Aden, and all. So these three powers and any reconciliation, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, will affect peace in Yemen and has to be addressed. Turkey and Qatar also, since the Arab Spring, and their relationships with some of the political groups in Yemen is important. Egypt as a regional power with history in Yemen since the 60s. So all these regional powers and what they want and what's going on regionally have to be addressed, and we cannot forget any of them. National, Yemen and what's going on inside Yemen is also very important. People talk about North-South relationships. Without the right to self-determination of the southern people of Yemen, nothing will be solved. This is at the core, at the center of everything that is Yemen, and that issue has to be addressed. It has to be included. It has to be part of any solution, any discussion for peace in Yemen, but that's not easy. That's much easier said than done. How will that look? We're just drawing a line as it was North Yemen and South Yemen before will no longer take care of it. So although we need the right to self-determination, how that will happen, what will happen to Hadramaut, what will happen to Shabwa? So it's a complex issue, but it has to be part of any peace talks for Yemen. It really has to be part of that. There are North-North issues, tribal vendettas, problems that have gone for a long time, but maybe the biggest and most complex is the South-South relations. I mean, people think of the Southern Transitional Council and President Hadi's government as one front against the North, against the Houthis. It ain't like that, Khalil. It is not like that at all. It's way more complex. I wish I had 2 hours to go through it. When you think of Hadi and the group, the ideological differences with the Southern Transitional Council that boiled out into open war, that the Air Force was used on the capital Aden in 1986, and how that the ideological differences, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks at that time, and how the tribal affiliations of Abiyan and Shabwa on the one hand, of Radfan, Yafa and Dala on the other, and how will this be resolved has to be addressed. It's not just the North against the South. The South-South issues are much more complex than any of that. And if anybody has a question about that, I'd be more than happy to address it, but it'll take much longer time than that. So again, it's complex. National issues are complex, but if you even go to the subnational level, in cities, in Aden itself, in the complexities of Aden right now, the airport and outside of airport and what's going on in many other cities, but what breaks my heart is the city of Taiz as an example. My favorite, my beloved city of Taiz. And what's going on in Taiz right now, at the top level, at superficial level, it's seen as Houthis against the Muslim Brotherhood or Islah, of fighting. It's way deeper than that. These are historical issues between families and groups. I mean, it's the center of education, it's the capital of cultures, Taiz. But the wars right now, street to street level, some carry the banner of the Houthis and others carry the banner of the Muslim Brotherhood. But these are issues that preceded that. There are issues that need to be resolved at the local level in many cities around Yemen. And again, these issues have to be addressed. I'm not trying to tell people that this is intractable or cannot be solved, but you cannot address Yemen issues superficially through a peace meeting in Geneva, shake hands and move on. And if I have a little more time, I just want to give you an example. So we need to deal with the international level, with the global terror. We need to deal with the regional level, the national level, subnational. But sometimes it's cross-regional and national. I'll give one example in the whatever time I have left. So we need to address the existential threat to both sides, the Saudis and the Houthis, and to build trust between them before we can move forward. So it's that complex, even at the regional, and I'm so glad to hear Special Envoy Lender King talking about this. We need to build confidence, for example, and this is necessary, but it's absolutely not sufficient to address the threat, the existential threat that the Saudis feel they will not allow a Hezbollah-like organization to their south, fully armed, feel they're threatening them. They're not going to accept that. The Houthis, on the other hand, will not accept to lay down their arms because they feel, rightfully or wrongfully, many people feel it's true, if they lay down their arms, they will be massacred, they will be finished. So you need to build trust. And so maybe if there's an investment zone somewhere in the north that was talked about in 2000, but never done, instead of depopulating these areas, populate them and create opportunities and create jobs, maybe that would build trust between the two of them, but you need to address all of these issues. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdulwahab, for this great introduction. I think you pointed out again in detail the complexity of this conflict, and we need to focus on that if we are to succeed in pursuing a peaceful solution, a political solution to this 6+ year-old conflict that has nagged the whole region, as a matter of fact. Let's shift gears a little bit now by moving to focus more on the humanitarian conditions in Yemen, particularly the unfortunate politicization of aid that has taken place over the past few years. Samar Nasser, the microphone is yours.
Thanks so much, Khalil, and thanks to the Arab Center for this timely event and for allowing us to speak on this matter. As some of you are aware, Yemen is now entering the 7th year of war, and around 24 million people are in need of aid assistance. As Khalil brought up earlier on, there are around 4 million IDPs, which is challenging on its own because Yemen is not like a Syria where there's movement and flow going into different countries or neighboring countries. We're very limited. There's around 2 million young children that are malnourished. They're, amid the conflict, the health sector truly has been deteriorating daily and faces unprecedented challenges. Effectively, I think roughly around 300 health facilities have been closed due to the lack of resources and funding. And around half of Yemen's population of around 29 million people do not have adequate water access, and as a result, increases the chance of communal disease spread. Just a snapshot of the COVID-19 crisis in Yemen. There's around over 2,100 cases that are official. From that, around 1,400 recoveries and 600 and some deaths. Most of these cases and even deaths are actually male. So we're assuming culturally men tend to go out more than women, so they get infected faster. Some facilities are actually run by INGOs and others by the Ministry of Health. Some are not operational due to the lack of funding, which is unfortunate because there is capacity, but it's just being cut short. Their official reporting from Sana'a is roughly around 4 cases versus Aden, which is the majority of the cases that are being officially tallied. In Sana'a, they unfortunately use the first case as, I really think, a discriminatory case where they used an African immigrant as the first case to show that it's coming from the outside versus travel from Yemenis within. There are gaps in funding tools and even ventilators for a country of 30 million, 29 million. There's around 300 ventilators, which is absolutely ridiculous for that size of a population. I would tend to highlight this as numbers that should be taken with a grain of salt, given the massive gaps among the testing kits. And even the testing kits, there are roughly around 30,000 kits for Yemen, which is, again, just absolutely horrendous. Just to get an understanding of the COVID crisis, which I'm assuming is really an underlying issue that I hope other Yemeni experts and professionals and researchers look to explore. The first few months of COVID in the city of Aden, we had recorded a normal death rate of between 10 to 12 from natural causes. Once the pandemic started to pick up, we've seen an increase of 90 to 120 deaths per day just between the months of, I believe, late April to June. So it shows you, unfortunately, without testing, we cannot consider these COVID tests, but given the trend, we assume that that would be the case. Over $4 billion have been pledged to Yemen, making it the most country, from my understanding, has been supported in modern times. Most of the funding has been given to Yemen that are usually implemented in food security sector, given the deepening reality of famine, but also following that is the wash and health sector. Now, the funding has been obviously compared to other years, much lower. So there are some decline in project implementation. In terms of humanitarian access, I will talk about this from a comparison of certain provinces, just because of the certain de facto authorities on the ground. In the north, specifically under Houthi authority, women have to travel with a legal guardian, and if not, they're harassed and ultimately returned, which delays project implementation. So these are women who actually work in these, these agencies. Detained staff, also incidents occur in areas under government control, but as in many cases, they're later released. In Hodeidah, which is a key province here, I think even politically, local authorities have delayed projects, or Houthis have delayed projects due to interference and demands of change even after agreements have been signed. And so in 1 month alone, between November and December, around 400 incidents have been reported in areas of Houthi authority and around 150 incidents in government areas. Just to take note, the UN panel of experts had shared, obviously, their constant concern of Houthis using pressure and intimidating aid agencies, which obviously pushes them to follow on ethical guidelines on the ground, and then forcing them to hire these aligned groups or members of these groups within their agencies. So they become, unfortunately, they're not independent anymore. The prolonging of licenses on the ground in areas of the north as well have been hurting residents. And I say this as a person who works on the ground and works constantly, and this is what we're seeing. Operationally, though, conflict is a huge situation. So conflict actually deteriorates conditions of aid delivery. So I would like to highlight that the current escalation of Ma'rib, which holds around 3 million IDPs that have actually fled violence, is now under threat again. And it's a city that is really this symbolic into stability and prosperity. And this type of aggression by Houthis will create a humanitarian catastrophe. As with the same with Vala, the southern province, which is a strategic location between South and North Yemen, is constantly under Houthi aggression. We've seen that these IDPs have started to move inward to Aden. And unfortunately, we hear deaths every single day. As with Taiz, the central of Yemen, province of central Yemen, humanitarian siege continues. And I think it's one of the most challenging areas to deal with given the mountainous region and just such a small city with millions and millions of people. It's really impacting how aid agencies work on the ground. And actually, a lot of INGOs have limited their work in that area, but it is one of the most populated areas in the country. There are problems with humanitarian interventions. Yemen's overall humanitarian intervention has not been effective. It doesn't affect, it's not effective in alleviating the suffering of Yemen, and it's creating actually more dependability on foreign aid rather than Yemeni dependability through skills and labor. And so the current INGO approach deviates Yemenis from re-entering the public workforce. The economic situation is complex, as maybe some of you guys will touch upon later on. But it really is the central reason of why the humanitarian crisis continues to worsen. So obviously, decline of economy, the aid cannot catch up. But I would suggest that we look at Yemen twofold. So quickly, just looking at every province has specific needs. The politicizing of Yemen's intervention in terms of aid is complicit. I mean, INGOs, and I say this someone who works in this field, we've seen INGOs complicit in weaponizing aid and local actors to utilize aid that support fighters through commodity and monetary means, which is why Yemen Aid has been having a lot of problems working specifically in northern areas. While we choose to not agree to unethical decisions because of this pressure. There are corruptional acts, specifically in mostly Houthi areas in terms of the aid, as you've seen from US aid of complaining. There are many UN reports regarding this matter. And there's also adhering to illegal taxation of aid to reach its destination. Aden and Taiz, for example, sometimes, and actually I was in Yemen in 2019, so I've seen this on hand, where INGOs have understood the requests and needs of these areas, specifically in Taiz and Aden, which is much more stable than compared to the conflicts up in the north. These INGOs divert the aid to Sana'a. And what happens then is that they actually ask the government and Aden to request those items from Sana'a, which is obviously not going to work in favor. So there is obviously an issue regarding items in the airports. Now, there is obviously a politicizing of ports between Aden and Hodeidah ports. And I've seen this firsthand. INGOs have been sending hundreds of shipments to Aden to pressure them to, let's say, release them as quickly as possible. Given that we know that that's not possible, they then use that as an internal discussion to say that Aden is not capable of handling these aids and that they would rather use Hodeidah and under Houthi authority. So I mean, we'll touch upon it later on. I will end here, but I think it's a problem that we need to continue to explore.
Thank you, Samar, very much. Let's go ahead and move to the next speaker, Sama Al-Hamdani, who will help us kind of focus on the emergence of this conflict, as I referred to earlier in my introductory remarks, from essentially an internal Yemeni conflict, and it got eventually, unfortunately, regionalized and then internationalized, and how these other parties got attracted to it and kind of increased the complexity of the conflict. Sama, the microphone is yours, please.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the Arab Center for hosting us, and also the two previous speakers who perfectly set up my discussion moving forward, because they touched on two important issues that allows me to expand more on the role of regional powers in Yemen. Of course, we have today the benefit of hindsight that gives us insight into what the war actually was trying to do in Yemen. Of course, in Yemen's case, the war erupted as a force of power that came in from the Arab coalition. The Arab coalition, when the war started, included Qatar. It was Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and many other countries. Of course, today, that's not the case anymore. And that's because alliances continue to shift on the ground. Whenever I talk about regional powers, I want us to always remember that the relationship of these regional powers to each other is unique, and then their dynamics to Yemenis and to Yemen is also unique and different, which is why today when we think of the Arab coalition, we primarily think of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Looking at the Arab coalition, I would say clearly today we see that Saudi Arabia and the UAE had different interests in Yemen, and that manifested itself sometimes when we see the proxies of the UAE represented in the Southern Transitional Council fighting with the government of Yemen, even though they entered into the Riyadh agreement. Of course, Qatar and Turkey still play a prominent role in Yemen's war, but not the same role as before. They also have their allies and proxies in Yemen represented in the Muslim Brotherhood. And also, Iran has a huge role in Yemen, as one would imagine. And a lot of us would say that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is behind a lot of the strategic movements that Houthis have made in the past few years. Looking at the role of the US, one would say, and I would agree with what Abdulwahab said earlier, that the US's role was somewhat absent for 4 years. And what we're witnessing today is just the re-emergence of the US's natural role. For me, this is how I would assess it, as just a return to how the US would have conducted the war had we not had the Trump administration in place. Of course, what we saw in terms of the US's role in Yemen's war is that they benefited a lot from the sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE that is now temporarily frozen. I think that what the US is seeking in the region right now is nothing short of just restoring the old status of power in the region. Right now you have Qatar agreeing and reconciling with Saudi Arabia and the restoration of the GCC. And in a sense, I suspect that what the US will try to do in Yemen is to restore things to how they were prior to the conflict that we've seen in Yemen. Of course, I think that that will be very different moving forward in the future. And the reason for that is that the war definitely has shaken the area. And on that note, I would like to say that the proxies that were created in Yemen were created differently. The way that Saudi Arabia and the UAE create proxies in Yemen is very different than the way that Iran fosters and nurtures their proxies in the region. And because of that, we see their proxies interacting with each other quite differently within Yemen. The US's role, without a doubt, is a welcome step moving forward. Is what the US doing enough to stop the Yemeni conflict? I really doubt it. I think that what the role can do for sure is remove the involvement of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But in order to actually stop the conflict and result in real peace, you'd have to engage the Yemeni parties. And the way that all these actors, including the US, the way that they're looking at Yemen is quite different. Because, for example, Iran looks at Yemen as a way to hurt Saudi Arabia or as a tool to kind of advance in the region, but it's not as essential and crucial as Yemen is to Saudi Arabia, because to Saudi Arabia, it's a security threat. It's right next, it's their next door neighbor. And so I think for the US and Iran, ultimately, the way that they're going to look at Yemen is not the way that Yemenis would look at Yemen, or the way that Saudi Arabia would look at Yemen, or the way that the UAE would look at Yemen. And because of that, I think that the US looks at Yemen as a tool or a key to resolving the Saudi-Iranian proxy war and definitely reducing the tensions between Iran and the US. And that is what we're seeing here. Now, of course, what happened is quite, to me, what's the steps that were taken by the US administration were quite quick. And I was quite surprised to see that the UK did not endorse what the US was doing or to follow steps. It kind of happened in silo. Today, right now, as we're speaking, the United Nations Security Council is meeting, and I suspect or think that they would endorse the steps that Biden's administration has taken. The EU Parliament has met a few times and have issued decrees that are very strong in favor of ending the war. The European Union ambassador and other ambassadors from Europe have visited Yemen. The UN envoy and the US envoy met with Saudi officials in Saudi Arabia. So things are moving quite quickly. And we see the role of several countries coming into play. But I would like to talk more about the future. What's next? What can be done? I think that since we talked about how the war affects Yemenis, and Samar touched a lot on how the humanitarian situation is and how awful it is, I think we can all agree that the war affects Yemenis the most. And in order for peace to be lasting and long, we need to have the Yemenis sign in or buy in into the peace process that's moving forward. We have not set the ground for that to happen. So any peace settlement that Yemen is going to have in the near future, as long as it doesn't include Yemenis buy-in, it's likely to fail. And it's likely to trap Yemen in a cycle of wars where Yemen is going to end up being a country with no regional involvement and no commitment from Saudi Arabia and the UAE to continue funding and helping with the aid situation, but with continuous turmoil within. In order to avoid that situation, I highly think that the role of Oman needs to be activated. Of course, Oman is a country that plays a role in this conflict for sure. However, Oman is a place where Yemenis can meet and interact and talk with each other. And the US can definitely benefit from Oman's neutrality or semi-neutrality during this conflict in order to prepare Yemenis into entering into a real peace deal. I've set up a few points, but I think ultimately we are all probably, I think all panelists are going to be in agreement that the beneficiaries of the conflict will not want to end the conflict soon. So this international push towards peace. So I think right now we're in a race. Who's going to bring peace to Yemen? Is it the US? Is it the Biden administration? Or is it the force of the EU that actually for the first time talked about bringing criminals to court, to international court? Or is it going to be the UN envoy who's been working on Yemen for a long time? Or can they work jointly to present long-lasting peace in the region? I think with this, I'm going to end my remarks. I know that they're probably not as long as everyone else, but I think that that's actually because I would love to engage in a Q&A later on to explore and dissect the proxies of these regional actors to Yemen and their relationships to each other. And I'm happy to comment later on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their alliance and the tensions that we've seen in the past few days manifesting. I think those are really important to note as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Sama. In congressional language, we will reserve the balance of your time for the Q&A session. We'll direct a question or two at you for that 1.5 minute extra that you gave up during your initial presentation. It's actually appreciate the input you gave us, Sama, and it's a perfect transition to Nadwa's presentation, since she wanted to also focus more on potential peace talks, the roles of the conflicting parties, and her own recommendations for a resolution to the conflict. Nadwa, the microphone is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Khalil, and thank you to the Arab Center for having me today. So I was asked to talk about the peace talks and recommendations for a resolution. But before then, I want to comment on Biden decisions in Yemen. I commend his decisions, and I think both appointing Linder King and also revoking the designation of the Houthis were the right decisions. Although I disagree with the way he revoked the designation. But my worry, I'll say this before I go into the peace talks and the recommendations for a resolution. My worry is that Trump looked at Yemen from an Iran lens, and now Biden wants to look at Yemen from a Saudi lens, and that my worry is that Biden will pressure the Saudis to get out of Yemen, by suspending arms sale, and force for a political settlement and call it a day. And as Yemenis, and it's funny that I was reading Linder King's first interview yesterday, and he pretty much said it. Yemen is the backyard of the Saudis, and so I worry that this momentum is temporary, or it will be long enough to create damage more than good. And as Yemeni, we Yemenis, we all want peace, but I'm not going to stick my head in the sand and pretend that everything is going to be okay. And and the current peace process is great. And I do actually have major misgivings about the current peace process led by the UN envoy, Martin Griffiths, which I think is deeply flawed. It has not worked, it will not work. And why? Because it is too fixated on a political settlement between the Houthis and Hadi's government. And I agree, to a large extent, both are not interested in ending the conflict. But it's also fixated on, Martin Griffiths also has back channel talks with the Saudis to help bring the Houthis and the Saudis into agreement. And creating a better understanding between the Houthis, or building trust between the Houthis and the Saudis is a good thing, but it's not going to solve the conflict. The current peace process is completely disconnected from the reality on the ground, and it fails to account for the power dynamics and the military situation as well. It offers extremely simplistic solution for an extremely complex conflict, as Abdulwahab explained. So the fixation on a political settlement. A political settlement is not going to end the war or mitigate the humanitarian situation, much less bring Yemen to peace. The current talks overlook other Yemeni actors, and Abdulwahab mentioned that these actors have influence on the ground beyond Hadi and Houthis. These include the Southern Transitional Council, other southern groups, West Coast forces, Taiz, Marib, and Hadramaut, Mahara, all these other areas that are not currently represented in the talks. But the lack of inclusivity is not the only problem with the UN peace talks. It's one of the problems, but it's certainly not the biggest problem in the talks. So Martin Griffiths has been trying to push for a ceasefire for years now with no success, because while the UN and the international community, including the US, have successfully put pressure on the Saudis and Hadi's government, and it's forced them to de-escalate several times, including in Stockholm and also in the East. We cannot say the same thing about the Houthis. In fact, this pressure did the opposite for the Houthis. So I'll talk about the Stockholm agreement that was, was agreed between the Hadi's government and the Houthis. I'm not sure that they even signed an agreement. It was just a verbal agreement, I think. It was reached in December 2018, and everybody celebrated the huge success. And we Yemenis warned against it. But we were relegated to warmongers because we were against the Stockholm agreements, because we saw what's coming next, and now it happened. So what happened after that, Houthis used this, of course, the Saudis, the Emiratis stopped, the Saudis stopped the offensive, Hudaida, Yemeni forces stopped. But what happened was that Houthis used that ceasefire as ceasefires before to regroup and expand militarily east of Sana'a. They made huge military gains, and now they're threatening Marib, which is the last stronghold of the Yemeni government that has 3 million civilians living in it. In fact, yesterday, they have pulled a lot of their forces from the West Coast into Marib. They are determined to take Marib. And so I think that the Stockholm Agreement, in the name of peace, have inadvertently allowed the Houthis to expand and make substantial military gains at the expense of Yemen, thwarting any chances for peace in the future. It tipped the military balance in favor of the Houthis, to put it more clearly. So the same thing will happen now if a political settlement is forced down the throat of Yemenis in the name of peace. And that's my worry with all the statements coming from the Biden administration and Linder King and others. Everybody's too fixated as a political settlement to end the war in Yemen, but it's not going to end the war in Yemen. It's going to exactly do the opposite. And let me talk a little bit about the Houthis. They're not willing to de-escalate. They've demonstrated this over and over and over and over. They're not willing to de-escalate. They do not recognize any other Yemeni actor. They define this war as a war between them and the Saudis. They call everyone who is opposed to them, including the tribes, the Yemeni government, everyone, as either mercenaries or ISIS. They believe in a divine right to rule over Yemenis as descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So you either accept that or you are their enemy. They rule with extreme repression, and UN reports are out there for you to read if you want to know more about that. They're not listening to the Omanis, they're not listening to the Saudis, they're not listening to the envoy, they're not listening to the EU. They also will not listen to Iran. Even if Iran, show interest in which I doubt, to talk to them. So how can you negotiate with that? As I said, they're now threatening Marib, and if they take Marib, they will not stop there. They will move south. They will retake the rest of Yemen. They are much more superior than other Yemeni groups in terms of weaponry and training. And if they take Yemen, they will push. It will be a matter of time before they push north inside Saudi Arabia. Mark my words. So a political settlement under the current circumstances will not bring peace only, will not bring peace. Quite the opposite. It will further embolden the Houthis, putting Yemen and the region at grave risk. And I think that should not be taken lightly. So what can happen, realistically? What can everybody does? I know that I'm painting a very grim picture, but that's the reality, and we need to acknowledge it. And we cannot just pretend that it's not. It's good to talk to the Iranians, it's good to talk to the Omanis, it's good to talk to the Saudis, but at the same time, it's really bad to try to force something that obviously will not work. But what can happen realistically? I think it is very, very important that the Houthis are pushed far away militarily, far away from Marib, or far enough from Marib in order for Marib to be safe. The UN and the international community should stop pressuring the Yemeni government from taking military action to protect Marib in the name of ceasefire, because again, the Yemeni government accept the ceasefire, the Saudis accept the ceasefire, but the Houthis do not. We've seen that unfolding over 2 years now. Weakening the Houthis militarily is imperative to create conditions for peace. And I know what I'm saying is controversial, but again, this is the reality, and we have to acknowledge it. We cannot just jump over, reality. So what can be done meanwhile? One, do not push for a political settlement, because it will make matters worse. Yemen is not ready for a political settlement right now. Yes, talks are good, but don't push for a political settlement. It's just not going to work. And as I said, it's going to make matters worse. And when I say that, people are asking me, so what is the alternative? The alternative is to follow your own rule, UN and the international community. Do no harm. Do no harm. If you push for a political settlement, you will do more harm than good, as it has happened repeatedly in the case of Yemen. In 2011, 2014, 2018, we can't just keep doing the same thing and expect different results. So instead of being too focused on a political settlement, meanwhile, focus on mitigating the impact of the war on civilians. Facilitate talk to open roads, seaports, airports, salaries, salary payments, improve local economy, all these things that will help mitigate the war and hopefully, over time, build trust between the different parties. And you're asking me what the solutions are. I am not sure. I mean, it's hard to predict the future. All I can say is that right now, there doesn't seem to be viable solutions through peaceful talks only. Yemen conflict will end one day. It's, every conflict ends, but it's going to be on Yemeni's terms, not on the UN terms, not on the international, community's terms. Only Yemenis will decide when peace will happen. And right now, there are no enough incentives for many parties to end the conflict. But I know that a political settlement under the current circumstances will most likely reinforce the current power dynamics and lock Yemen into a cycle of perpetual war, bringing 30 million Yemenis closer to famine and pushing the country farther away from peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadwa, for this kind of cautious pessimism or cautious optimism with regards to a political solution. But I think it's definitely food for thought as we pursue this a little bit more, maybe during the Q&A session. Last but not least, our good friend Nabeel Khoury, who spent, of course, some time in Yemen, as I said in the introductory remarks, as DCM, and has focused on this conflict for many years. He will try to help us again look at the U.S. Role, even though several of you speakers have touched on this, put it in a more kind of diplomatic and political context, and present us with some also recommendations about moving forward. Nabeel, the microphone is yours, please.
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you, Tamara, Khoury, both of you for putting me even in the virtual presence of my Yemeni friends. And I almost said my young Yemeni friends, because looking at Abdulwahab, he looks as young as he did when I first met him about 25 years ago. And he inspired me with optimism then, and he still does. So I'm very thankful for that. I think that there is a new opportunity for peace in Yemen, and there is new hope for Yemen. However, there are also many obstacles, some of them very serious obstacles, for that hope to materialize. And a part of it is that all the warring parties have to see this opportunity and seize this opportunity for peace and start working towards it. I actually started looking at Yemen in 1990 when I was in Riyadh as the US Cultural Attaché. And I was witness to the victimization of Yemenis, close to 1 million of them who were residents of Saudi Arabia, perhaps for all their lives, were kicked out of Saudi Arabia for political reasons. The fact that Ali Abdullah Saleh at that time sided with the PLO and with Saddam Hussein against the US war to liberate Kuwait. And so he was punished by both the US and by Saudi Arabia. But the ones who were really punished were the Yemeni people, and not so much the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh. This, and I witnessed it firsthand because I knew some of the Yemenis in Saudi Arabia, and I witnessed how not just the government officials in Saudi Arabia, but the Saudi elite, academic and otherwise, none of them were sympathetic even to the plight of the Yemenis. They thought that they deserved to be kicked out of Saudi Arabia. This typified what I've seen over the years, which is from an American perspective, Yemen is always looked at for some other reason, not for Yemen itself. And the prism is something else. So in 1990, it was the war, and it was Saddam Hussein. And does Yemen fit? Is it with us or against us? Towards the end of the 90s, and then we had the beginning of global war on terrorism. We had the coal incident in 2000 in Aden, and then, of course, 9/11 here. And at that time, Ali Abdullah Saleh decided to learn from his previous mistake. And so he went along with the US, and he allowed the FBI and the CIA to come in and try to pursue the Al-Qaeda terrorists who had committed these twin acts, one in Yemen and then one in New York. And after that, the collaboration with Yemenis was the collaboration with their security apparatus in pursuit of terrorists, and not really looking at the broad picture of Yemen. In comes the Obama administration, and the global war on terror continues, but in the Obama case, Yemen was sacrificed at the altar of signing the nuclear agreement with Iran. So the JCPOA was the reason that the Obama administration decided to not only greenlight the war that the Arab coalition launched, but to give it very, very important critical support. Now, after all this usage of Yemen for other than Yemeni purposes, the reason I see some hope here is because for the first time in a long time, we have an administration in the US that I think gets Yemen to the point that any American politician or any American diplomat for that matter can understand Yemen and the complexity inside Yemen. But relatively speaking, we have an administration that is looking at Yemen. Perhaps it is the enormity of the humanitarian disaster that is making them do that, and politically the pressure of the progressive wing within the Democratic Party to focus on ending the war in Yemen. For both these reasons, I think this administration has put Yemen first and is not thinking of it as a pawn in the struggle with Iran or in the struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they put their action where their speeches were by immediately taking steps that Abdulwahab talked about that show how serious this administration is in trying to end the war in Yemen. Now, as a side benefit, if you end the war in Yemen, you will ease the tensions between the US and Iran, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, if you do it the right way. But that is not the main reason. The main reason is to stop this war that has devastated an entire nation and that is likely to devastate the entire new generation in Yemen, unless not just the US, but the entire international community focuses on ending this war. There are several things that the US needs to be careful about, that the Biden administration needs to be careful about. First of all, having a team and a special envoy is a very good first step. But that envoy has to have the full backing and active participation of the president and the Secretary of State in the US. Starting with the international level, you have to move simultaneously at the international, regional, and national Yemeni levels for this war to end. And I'm happy to see that the Security Council is meeting today. This is not something for Tim Lenderking. This is something for President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken to very actively persuade, push the permanent five at the Security Council to follow the steps of the Biden administration, to stop the shipment of arms and to put the weight of their diplomacy behind the American diplomatic effort to end this war. There needs to be a concert. It needs to be unanimous at the UN Security Council. Otherwise, one power takes advantage of the other power's withdrawal from the conflict, and the conflict goes on. So that's number one. Number two, at the regional level, there needs to be a collaboration, which has indeed started between Tim Lenderking and Martin Griffiths. And I agree that the UN envoy and the special mission there has been flawed. It had and still has a lot of problems, but I think collaboration between the two is nonetheless necessary. And here again, you have to look at the grand policy and what is happening at the State Department in terms of a strategic review of the relationship between the United States and the key Gulf countries is an important corollary to go along with the focus on ending the war in Yemen. All these parts have to be coordinated. The relationship with Saudi Arabia has to be well calibrated, well balanced, that yes, we are going to stay allies or strategic partners, whatever you want to call it. But there are going to be conditions. We're going to be honest with you. And where you are wrong, we are going to tell you that you are wrong. Also, the strategic relationships in the Gulf need to be balanced. In the past 4 years, they were heavily leaning towards Saudi Arabia and the UAE. You need to bring in not only Oman, as Sama said, but also Qatar. Qatar and Oman have been viewed as benign powers largely in Yemen. And they have both tried very hard in the past to mediate without having any particular economic or strategic interest themselves. And so the relationship between the US and these two countries needs to be elevated, and in particular, where it concerns peace in Yemen. The third part of this, the third leg of this, if you will, is the national scene inside Yemen. And this step is going to be the most difficult. I agree with all the previous speakers about how complicated the situation is inside Yemen and how difficult it is for an American diplomat, no matter how skilled, to get into that mix. Nevertheless, the US needs to find a balance between too forceful and arrogant an intervention and benign neglect. I've witnessed often when I got back from Yemen and tried to get the State Department and the leadership to focus on Yemen and to help Yemen avert a disaster. And we're talking about 2008, before the snowballs started rolling down the hill. And people would raise their hands and say, oh, you know, who wants to get in the middle of all this tribal conflict? And who are the Houthis anyway? I mean, as late in the game as 2010, people were asking me to explain who the Houthis were. So you need to move away from that, from raising up your hands and saying, oh, that's too complicated for me. Or to, you know, the arrogance of the US intervention in Iraq, to go in there, march in and say, I can fix the whole thing. No, but strike a balance. The US needs to be involved, but it needs to be involved cautiously and with the help of Oman, the closest to the situation in Yemen. Also, the Tim Lenderking's team needs to be beefed up properly. It can't just have a few NEA officers from the State Department. It needs to have Arab American talent, and it needs to have Yemeni talent. The team needs to include Yemenis both on the ground in Yemen and outside, because you cannot do this without understanding the way Yemenis think. And again, I mean, there are different Yemeni points of view. Obviously, the situation is highly polarized, and some people will immediately blame the Houthis for everything, and others will immediately blame the Saudis for everything. You need to understand both points of view. Both are legitimate. Both see things that you and I, as outsiders, probably don't see or don't see clearly. So this, I think, all needs to be done. And I have a feeling that we are moving in this direction. To some extent, I'm pleased to see how quickly the administration has stepped in to this problem. But there is also going to be a gradual approach to beefing up the US envoy's team. It's not going to be up to full speed right away, particularly with the pandemic going on and the travel restrictions and all that. Communication between the US envoy's team needs to be with all sides to the conflict. One of the main problems right now to getting a ceasefire is that the Houthis are perhaps mistakenly seeing an opportunity to go full speed ahead in Marib and gain a strategic advantage before a ceasefire is imposed somehow. I think this is a big mistake because they might be driving the Biden administration away rather than thinking that they're always going to be on tap for them. The Biden administration is on tap currently. The Houthis can communicate directly or indirectly with the US government right now, but they will miss the opportunity if they think that they can go full speed ahead in Marib. The other reason they should not do that is because the other sides are being energized. The attacks in Marib are energizing the Hadi coalition. They're energizing tribes inside Yemen and outside Yemen who were not necessarily unified on this issue, but who will get unified and who will put their military effort behind an opposition to the Houthi takeover. The conflict from Marib can continue all over Yemen for a long time if it doesn't end right away. And I hope that, as I said, at the international, regional, and local levels, all these efforts can come together to get the immediate ceasefire, first of all, and then start to build on that towards a full political settlement. It'll be a tough road ahead, but I am more optimistic than I have been in a long time. So let's hope my optimism is not misplaced. And thank you again, Khalil.
Thank you, Nabeel, very much. Appreciate all the presentations from all the speakers. I think you have encouraged our audience of a couple of hundred people to send lots of questions, which we can't accommodate all of them, judging from the numbers received thus far, but let's try. Please, I would urge you to make your answers very short. As short as 1 minute would be ideal to try to squeeze as many of these questions as possible. Nabeel, you just discussed the issue of Ma'rib. Jalal Mauri wanted to know from Nadwa if she has any additional comments on this conflict in Ma'rib. Why is it different? What makes Ma'rib different from Al-Jawf or Sana'a and the rest of the territories that were taken by the Houthis?
Well, I mean, there's no conflict in Sana'a. Houthis already control Sana'a, so that's different. The Marib is the last stronghold of the government. It is also, it sits on much of Yemen's oil and all Yemen gas. So it's a major resource center. Capturing Marib will allow Houthis, it's also the gate to the south. So to Hadramaut and also to Shabwa, both are oil rich. And so capturing Marib will risk allowing Houthis to move south and capture these areas as well in the future. Also, Marib is where 3 million civilians live. So over the past 4 years, millions of Yemenis relocated to Marib, including 800,000 IDPs, because it's safer. Many of these civilians fled Houthi-controlled areas, escaping Houthi prosecution. So you can imagine the scale of humanitarian disaster if that happened. When Marib have bloomed, it has become a success story during the war. It went from being a marginalized, underdeveloped area to relatively, area with relative stability and good local economy. I'm talking relatively speaking. There is a university in Marib, schools, businesses, all that is at risk. When Houthis entered Al-Jawf last year, they closed the university, they closed the schools, they bombed houses, they prosecuted opponents. So you can imagine, and Al-Jawf was only like 100,000 people, so it wasn't really many people, the main city. So you can imagine the scale of the destruction that would happen if Houthis take over Marib. Not to mention the strategic, downside to their capturing the governorate.
Thank you, Nadwa. The next question comes from Karen Dabrowska, journalist, regarding the STC attacking a convoy of military vehicles. It's somewhat related to what you just explained, but the troops that were moving, I guess, that were attacked, they were moving towards Ma'rib to fight the Houthis. Does that mean the STC wants Ma'rib to fall? Who would like to tackle that one? Abdulwahab, would you like to take a jab at that one? How does that impact?
That's a tough, thank you, Khalil. I'll try just a quick answer. It's tough to understand what they want. It's obvious that for the STC, at the very least, their conflict, their internal conflict is more with the Hadi government, with the Hadi group, because of the tribal issues that I've mentioned, because of the history of war between the two parts of the communist/socialist party from 1980s and on, because of what Hadi and his group did in 1994 and come in joining forces of Ali Abdullah Saleh to actually defeat the group who had won in 1986. Again, it's very complex. Now, some say that they were letting the IRG in. Some are saying, no, they're letting others. I don't know what they want out of Ma'rib, for they want to fall. But I know that the STC would like more dominance of Southern decision-making and more of a political role in any future of Yemen under the former Southern Yemen's flag, and different than what Hadi and his government want. So I don't know what they want out of Ma'rib, to be honest with you.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Omar Masri. Hi, Omar. As the Yemen war appears to be waning, news is emerging that the UAE is demobilizing from its military base in Eritrea. In tandem, however, it appears that construction is well underway for a major Israeli intel gathering outpost on the Yemeni island of Socotra. How do you see this Israeli presence in Yemen fitting into Israeli strategy of putting the squeeze on Iran, and how would that impact Yemen? Sama, would you like to take a jab at this?
Sure. Although talking about Socotra, we've heard for many years that the UAE has had interests in Socotra, and historically, the UAE has always had a special relationship with Socotris, and during the conflict, they have issued passports to Socotri nationals and Yemeni nationals from Al-Mahra. They've given them Emirati passports to kind of ease the relationship between the UAE and people from that region. It's been really hard, though, to prove with evidence that is in fact what the UAE is doing, that they are developing a base. But we do know that the UAE's direction is a bit, it's different than the interests of Saudi Arabia, and that they are shaping their own strategy and shift in Yemen. It's very distinct. And the UAE's relationship with Israel has now become formal, and they've appointed their first ambassador to Israel. And of course, no kind of regional peace talk would take place without the blessing or somewhat the involvement of not just Israel, but also Egypt to a certain degree. I don't think that at the moment we can say very clearly that the UAE developing a base in Socotra would put any kind of squeeze on Iran, because, you know, if you look at the placement of where Socotra is from Iran, there's no actual clarity of how that would be used, but it is without a doubt the island could be developed to be a military base that would benefit the UAE in the region, although them doing it would make them look very, very bad in the region, because we've heard about their secret prisons, about their expansionist agendas. It wouldn't be in their interest.
Thank you very much. There has been some recent references in the media about USAID being involved somehow in smuggling weapons to the parties in Yemen. Summer, is there any evidence to that? Any comments on this issue?
No, there has, at least from my understanding, I have not seen that. It could be just, you know, mere gossip, but there's nothing structural, at least for now.
Rumors and innuendos.
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, Nadwa alluded to it. Ansarullah or Houthis, I know some people are offended when we call them Houthis, but that's the nomenclature that's been used these days. So I'll use both interchangeably, meaning Ansarullah or the Houthis. They are a real Yemeni group. They represent a certain region within Yemen. There's growth within them into other areas. They benefited the most by the war. By that, I mean by the Arab coalition attack. They really benefited in expansion. They're seen inside Yemen as the ones who are opposed to aggression, to put these between quotes. That's how they're perceived, and that's the source of most of their strength. They're able to use that very well through their media operations. That there's no time for us now to quarrel amongst ourselves. It's time to defend Yemen from the aggressors. They're very good at that. As Nadwa also said, they would probably benefit the most from a peace settlement. It's ironic, right? They're able to benefit from the war. They'll be the ones to benefit the most from a peace settlement. And I want to address what Nadwa said about the peace settlement, and I agree with her. Any peace settlement shoved down the throats of Yemenis right now would be counterproductive and hurtful. But I don't know if Nadwa agrees with that. A peace process with agreed on principles is absolutely necessary. And there was a question in there, I'd like to address it also, if I may, Khalil, about sequencing. Sure. I don't think it's a sequencing issue right now. We have to have, there has to be very skilled ability to chew and walk and juggle at the same time to be able to address this issue in Yemen. You cannot do this by sequencing. And one of the most important things that has to be done is create opportunity, create hope, bring in the Yemeni private sector, bring in the Saudi private sector, let them invest together, create jobs. That is what will take away strength of many of these military leaders, military leadership right now, because listen, it's more profitable right now to go join one of these militias, join one of these belligerents to fight, because you need to feed your kids, create opportunity. I work with the private sector in Yemen. They would jump on an opportunity for investments that create jobs in the north, create jobs in the south, bring in the Yemeni Hadrami business community in Saudi Arabia, and create these opportunities and again, create jobs. That is one of the main ingredients that will make this successful.
Okay, what did you mean by Iran and other regional actors engaging their proxies in different? What does that mean on the ground practically?
The way that they create a proxy in the first place is quite different. The way that Iran creates a proxy is a bit more addressing the proxy as an equal, giving them a certain elevated status. However, what we've seen in Yemen's wars with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, a lot of times the proxies just get a lot of money and are sometimes delegated orders of what to do and conduct on the ground. And because of the way that they create these proxies, the relationships between each other are quite different. And there are quite the fascinating articles actually between how the proxies of these countries even interact with each other. And we've seen it in Yemen's case in the sense that if we observe the way that the Houthi movement interacts with Hezbollah, even their, Iran's own proxies end up interacting with each other and having dynamics that we don't see, for example, in Yemen's case, where Saudi Arabia's proxies in Yemen don't really interact with Saudi Arabia's proxies in Syria and Iraq. So they build the proxies is quite different, and the way that they continue to influence them looks quite differently. Of course, other countries have different approaches, but here I'm just mentioning Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I actually wanted to touch and make a little bit of a comment on the idea of peace talks now. I think that if we don't push for peace talks now, we're going to actually see the Saudis, the Houthis expand and push just as they are pushing now. I think that the idea of pushing for peace talks is actually going to a little bit curb the influence of the Houthi movement, in the sense that the Houthis were not who they were at the start of the war. They are a much stronger force today, 6 years into war. And the reason that Iran continues to get more involved in Yemen's conflict is because of the failure of the JCPOA. So things are linked from a regional perspective to that. I think that what potentially would happen if there is no ceasefire, if there's no peace in Yemen, is we will see the emergence of a new axis in the region. And that axis is going to be represented potentially in Iran, Qatar, Hezbollah, the Houthis, maybe Oman, if they continue to be squeezed into a corner and not able to exercise their neutrality within the region. And so we could be stepping towards a new era. And I think it's really important for us to kind of maintain order and balance in the region. And so I think also it's important, and I haven't noted on this, that Saudi Arabia is quite ready for peace. They feel that they have financially bled into this conflict, and it is actually to their advantage to exit this war. And in a sense, appointing Mr. Tim Linderking in office, who, by the way, used to be the US chief of mission in Saudi Arabia, is Biden's administration trying to assess and help Saudi Arabia find a way to exit this war in a way that could restore peace to the region. So those are a few comments that I kind of crept into that question.
What percentage of Saudi and UAE weaponry do you consider to be offensive? What percentage of US weapons sales do you guys consider to be sold to the Saudis and the Emiratis? Do you consider to be offensive? And there is a follow-up kind of related question after that. Nabeel?
For me, it is not so much a question of weaponry, because I mean, if you can always interpret things differently, but certainly the smart bombs that are loaded onto the American and European jet fighters, those are offensive in nature. Really, the only thing that is clearly defensive is the Patriot system. In fact, several Patriot systems are deployed throughout Saudi Arabia. Those are defensive in nature, clearly, because they wait for an incoming rocket to attack it, and are not used to bomb Yemen from wherever they are. Everything else, including the ammunition to simple rifles, could be considered offensive. More importantly, it is the expertise, the targeting information, the intelligence. At the operations center in Riyadh, what are the American experts doing now? And is their expertise being withdrawn? How about the siege around Yemen? The American Navy is the main guarantor in that area. And Iran knows better than to send a big ship loaded with weapons to Yemeni shores, because the US Navy will be there. So those are complex questions, but I would go beyond the weapons into all strategic advice and training that feeds into the Saudi war effort. There is no harm, I think, in temporarily withholding these things until such a time when we feel that peace talks are seriously underway. At the same time, I agree that we should lean on Iran one way or another, because despite all the blockade, air and sea, they still managed to get some of their weaponry and parts of rockets and so on, and more importantly, expertise. So Iranian and Hezbollah experts are conducting training and offering strategic advice to Houthi fighters. That has to be put in the balance as well.
I know we're probably projecting maybe too far ahead before the start of a serious, substantive, and successful peace process in Yemen. But Summer, there are a couple questions about reconstruction in Yemen, considering the devastation that Yemen has been exposed to the past 6.5 years. Can Humpty Dumpty be put together again, and what does it take?
Honestly, Yemen's situation is very complex and it's very dim. And as Nadwa and others say, that we have to be realistic. I think one thing, before I even touch on the reconstruction aspect, is that Yemen comes with a file of many grievances. And whether it's the Southern cause, and I think that's the main case right now. And I would take note to separate the two entities of the STC and the Southern case, just because we don't want to militarize that case in a way where it kind of shadows that call of grievance. But I think for Yemen, every time I go into a panel, I'm really dumbfounded that we're not talking about the issue of identity in Yemen, and that Houthis come in from this is an ideological war, period. It's militaries on top of that, and weaponry is another layer of that. But I think throughout history, prejudice in cases of movements such as Houthis and ideological extremism is never accepted. So no matter how many times you do the peace process, I don't think it'll work. But in regards to reconstruction, we have a very big problem ahead of us. And I think this is where we try to call on the Yemeni diaspora to kind of build that plan ahead. We're in a country where half of the country is trying to rebuild their livelihood versus areas where it's completely in conflict. And so I would suggest INGOs start to look at how to build capacity of economic institutions, the Central Bank of Yemen, the private sector. These are really, really important areas that maybe I'm not an expert, maybe Abdulwahab will touch upon. But yes, we are in a very big problem. There is no unified INGO strategy to prevent the collapse of Yemen's economy, because all programs, or at least most of them, will end eventually, and that Yemenis will, for generations to come, be in below zero in regards to rebuilding their lives. And we're talking about a population of 70% youth. So this is a very big problem ahead.
So we started with Abdulwahab. Let's conclude with a minute from Abdulwahab in terms of the next steps, if you will, in solving the conflict in Yemen. How do we take the lead in finding a Yemeni solution to these issues by involving Yemenis, as you were also challenged by your colleague a minute ago to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, if I had a solution, boy, I would have given it a long time ago. There's no clear solution. We have to start the process. And the first is stop, add no harm, not just do no harm, just add no harm. Stop, open the airport, open the ports, bring in the goods, bring in good faith from all sides and move forward. But reconstruction is a very important issue, Khalil, that you brought. I'm not going to be long in this because it's an issue that we need to discuss for a long time. It is a burden of resources. Where are we going to bring the resources from? But it's also an opportunity. We all know that infrastructure and reconstruction is the best way to rebuild an economy, to create jobs. So let's see it that way, as an opportunity, and bring in like I said, bring in the private sectors. They will invest. Yemeni private sector can go anywhere in the world right now. I'm talking about the big businesses. They want to help Yemen. Bring them in, and don't involve them just with marching orders. Here, go build a factory. Bring them in the discussions about how to do this, how to move forward. Bring them in at building the strategies to do it. Let them have a voice in this, own the process, and move ahead with it. It's very, very hard, but I see reconstruction as an opportunity, not just as a burden. It's both.
Thank you, Abdulwahab. Thank you all five of you for your great presentations. I learned a lot from you guys today, and I'm sure the couple of hundred people who participated with directly through our website appreciated your input, judging from the fact that the numbers stayed high throughout, and I apologize, we're out of time. Thank you all for your participation, speakers and audience alike, and we look forward to hosting you again in future events.